I wanted to share this story as a reminder to stay alert whenever you're alone at night, especially at highway rest stops. This happened fairly recently while I was traveling through Tennessee with my father, who's been a truck driver for years. I tagged along with him for a few days because I'm planning to get my commercial driver's license in the next few years and wanted to see what life on the road is really like. We're from Alabama, so the trip to Tennessee wasn't very long, and we made it there the same day. His delivery was scheduled for early the following morning. Around 2 in the morning, we pulled into a roadside parking lot to spend the night. The truck stop was packed, but the restrooms were completely empty. I figured most of the drivers had already gone to sleep, so they'd be ready to deliver their cargo in the morning. As soon as we parked, my dad got into bed and fell asleep almost immediately. I've always been more of a night owl, so I couldn't fall asleep.
Around 3 a.m., I decided to go to the restroom. I also took my electric razor with me because I wanted to trim my mustache. Since it was already so late, I figured I'd be the only one there and could take my time, something I usually only do at home. The restroom was divided into 2 separate sections, one on the left and one on the right. I walked into the left side and noticed a very tall man standing near one of the urinals. He had to be around 6 feet 3 inches, maybe even taller. I didn't think anything of it at first. I went into a stall, used the bathroom, and then washed my hands. When I finished, I noticed he was still standing in the same area. Right as I was getting ready to leave, he unzipped his pants and started using the urinal. It made me a little uncomfortable, but I still didn't think too much about it. Instead of walking straight out, I crossed over to the restroom on the right to make it seem like I'd already left.
I stood in front of the mirror and started trimming the edges of my mustache. About 15 seconds later, that same man walked into the other side of the restroom. That's when alarm bells started going off in my head. He had already been in the other section, so there wasn't any obvious reason for him to come over where I was. He started walking in my direction, and the moment I pulled out my razor, he suddenly froze right behind me. The look on his face was almost like he'd been caught off guard, or something hadn't gone the way he expected. By then, I was genuinely nervous. I kept trimming my mustache as fast as I could without ruining it, doing my best to act calm. Watching through the mirror, I saw him walk over to a urinal and pretend to unzip his pants. When I looked back at him, he was staring directly at me while acting like he was using the urinal. He gave me a small nod, so I nodded back.
It wasn't because I felt comfortable. I just didn't want him to realize I suspected something was wrong. Roughly 20 seconds later, he walked into one of the empty stalls. The next time I glanced over, he wasn't doing anything at all. He was standing motionless in the corner of the stall, staring straight at me with his eyes wide open. I acted like I hadn't noticed. About 30 seconds later, he came back out, returned to the urinal, pretended to unzip his pants again, looked over at me for a moment, and then turned away. As soon as I finished cleaning up my mustache, I headed straight for the exit. I kept the razor in my hand as I walked past him in case I needed to defend myself. There was no way out without passing right by him. I'm not a small guy or physically weak, but he was significantly taller than I was and looked at least 25 years older.
I'm about around 5 feet 10 inches, and he looked to be around 45 years old. I knew that if things turned physical, he'd probably be able to overpower me. The second I stepped outside, I noticed security cameras mounted near the entrance, which made me feel a little safer. Thankfully, he never came after me. The relief hit me all at once. I walked back to my father's truck, where he was still asleep, just like all the other truck drivers parked around us. I texted a friend and told him everything that had happened. About 25 minutes later, he finally responded. He suggested I go back into the restroom while we stayed on a video call. For whatever reason, I actually agreed. By the time I went back, though, the man was gone.
I walked my friend through everything, showing him exactly where the guy had been standing and explaining the whole situation in detail. About 7 minutes later, I left the restroom again and ended the FaceTime call because my friend had to go.
As I walked outside, I noticed there was another parking lot behind the roadside rest stop for regular passenger cars. One dark blue stood out because its headlights were on, making it the only vehicle lit up in the entire lot. The moment I looked toward it, the headlights switched off. It was too dark and too far away for me to see who was inside. Maybe the driver had just parked. Maybe they were getting ready to leave. Or maybe it was even the same man from the restroom. I have no way of knowing, but the timing felt unsettling. I headed back to the truck, where my father was still fast asleep. The rest of the night passed without anything else happening, and eventually I went back to my normal routine. I never told my father about what happened. He's always been pretty strict, and he had only recently started letting me go places by myself. I was 16 at the time, and I knew that if I told him, he'd probably stop letting me go out alone until I turned 19 and was legally able to make my own decisions. The only person I ever told was my friend. Afterward, I kept trying to come up with a logical explanation. The man didn't look homeless or like he was under the influence of drugs, but his behavior definitely wasn't normal. His clothes were clean, his beard was well-groomed, and nothing about his appearance suggested he was homeless or high. What still sticks with me is wondering what his intentions were and why he acted the way he did. The thought that haunts me the most is what could have happened if I hadn't been holding that razor. Ever since that night, I've paid much closer attention to what's happening around me, even during the daytime, and I avoid being out alone late at night whenever I can. I'm 21 years old now, and I've spent my entire life living in New York City, so taking the train at all hours has always been second nature to me. For some context, my commute home takes about 3 hours one way. It involves riding 2 different trains, taking a 25-minute bus ride, and then walking 4 or 6 blocks through a poorly lit neighborhood. After doing that trip for years, I usually don't give it a second thought. Even so, there are 2 nights that I still can't get out of my head. The first one happened on the train. I got on just before the doors closed, so I stayed standing near the entrance. I had my headphones in when I faintly heard a homeless man saying something to me. At first, I ignored him because I assumed he was talking to himself, but he kept looking directly at me. That's when I clearly heard him insult me and call me a slut. My heart started racing immediately.
I can still remember how my ears and face suddenly felt burning hot. It was like every bit of blood in my body rushed straight to my skin. I started looking around at the other passengers, hoping someone would make eye contact and acknowledge what was happening. But no one would look at me for more than a second. Everyone avoided getting involved. When the train reached the next station, even though it wasn't my stop, I got off and hurried into the next train car, hoping he wouldn't notice where I'd gone or decide to follow me. The scary part is that situations like this aren't even uncommon when you're commuting in New York. Most people just avoid eye contact, stay quiet, and try not to engage with whoever is causing trouble. Even after I switched cars, I kept looking through the train windows to see if he'd followed me. 3 stops later, I finally watched him get off the train. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until the doors closed behind him.
The second incident happened while I was in graduate school. I had evening classes that usually ended around 9:30 p.m. So by the time I caught the bus home, it was normally after 11 o'clock. There's something about late-night bus rides that always feels different. They're quieter, and you never really know what to expect. Most drivers only stop if someone pulls the cord or requests a stop. That night, I was listening to horror stories during my commute, and the episode I had on was about a woman being followed. Because of that, I remember lowering the volume as soon as I got off the bus and becoming much more aware of everything around me. The last part of my walk home takes me past a few businesses,
before I have to turn onto a dead-end residential street that's extremely dark and poorly lit. One of the places along the way is a Wendy's. I remember thinking about going back to grab some fries and a few nuggets. I'd already walked past the restaurant and was almost at the end of the block before I finally decided to turn around. That's when I noticed a man who had been riding the same bus. Up until that point, I hadn't paid any attention to him, but the instant I changed directions, he completely stopped walking, almost like he'd frozen in place. Then he just stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. It immediately made me uneasy, but I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it and went into Wendy's anyway. Since it was so late, they barely had any food left. After only a minute or so, I walked back out and started heading home again. I was about halfway down the block when I saw him a second time. He was standing right at the entrance to the dark street I needed to walk down. He was just standing there, almost like he was waiting for someone. The moment I saw him, I immediately slowed down and called my brother. He's almost never home, so the fact that he actually answered felt like pure luck. I think he could tell something was wrong just from the way I sounded. As soon as I told him I was near Wendy's, he said he was coming to meet me right away. Knowing he was on his way gave me enough confidence to turn onto the dark street. As I walked past the man, I heard footsteps behind me. He had started following me. He stayed a short distance behind, matching my pace. Then, in a quiet voice, he told me he loved me before mumbling several other things I couldn't make out. At that point, I decided I needed to stay somewhere well lit, so I turned around, walked back toward the stores, and waited outside a nearby convenience store. Since I grew up in that neighborhood, I recognized many of the men who usually hung around there, and I kept looking around, hoping to see at least one familiar face. That night, though, I didn't recognize anyone. A few moments later, the man walked over to me. He kept asking if I needed help and insisted that he could help me, all while slowly getting closer. I loudly told him no several times. If he'd honestly thought I was lost and was simply trying to help, that would have been one thing. But I was clearly refusing, and he continued moving toward me anyway. That's when I noticed he was wearing latex gloves. This was well after the pandemic, so my first thought was that if he was being that cautious, why wasn't he wearing a face mask too? It also wasn't cold outside, so the gloves seemed completely out of place. Then he started repeatedly telling me that I needed to go home, almost like he was trying to convince me to walk back down that dark street with him nearby. A few seconds later, he went inside the convenience store. The instant I saw him move farther into the building, I turned the corner and finally saw my brother walking toward me. The whole encounter probably lasted around 7 minutes, but it felt much longer. That's the strange thing about experiences like that. Looking back, they seem so quick, yet while you're living through them, every second feels painfully slow. The next story I'm about to tell is easily one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It's also a perfect example of how an ordinary, enjoyable evening can suddenly turn into a real nightmare. This happened a few years ago when I was 22 years old. I'm 24 now. Even after all this time, I still remember every detail vividly. And to be honest, I still don't have a good explanation for what happened. For a little background, I grew up in a fairly large city in Eastern Europe. My neighborhood is made up of small houses, along with a few apartment buildings. There was nothing unusual about it. No abandoned buildings, dangerous streets, or sketchy areas. If anything, it could actually be a little boring sometimes. I also knew all of my neighbors personally, so I always felt completely safe living there. Back then, my routine was pretty simple. I'd go to my college classes, come home to study for exams, get some sleep, and then repeat the same schedule week after week. I barely had any free time. One Friday, though, my parents decided to spend the weekend visiting relatives in another city. They planned to arrive that afternoon,
stay through Saturday, and return sometime on Sunday. To me, that meant only one thing. I'd have the house entirely to myself for the whole weekend. For a 22-year-old, that sounded pretty great. I'd always enjoyed having the house to myself ever since I was a kid. It also gave me the perfect excuse to invite my friends over, since my school schedule didn't leave us many chances to hang out. I called them, and we made plans to get together on Saturday. We were going to order food, play video games, and spend the evening catching up.
There was just one problem before the weekend could start. I'd completely forgotten that my college's annual history trivia competition was scheduled for Friday evening. I'd already promised my classmates I'd participate, so I couldn't back out. Besides, I didn't have anything else planned for that night anyway. I figured it would be fun. Not to brag, but history has always been one of my strongest subjects. The evening started off great. My college friends and I formed a team of 6 people. There were 10 teams competing all together, and the campus auditorium was absolutely packed. Honestly, I hadn't expected such a huge turnout.
Everyone was having a great time. There was free food and drinks for all the participants, the atmosphere was lively, and before we knew it, we'd reached the final question. Not long after that, it was finally time for the results to be announced. Our team finished 3rd out of the 10 groups. We received a small prize, took a picture together, and then it was finally time to head home. My friends and I went our separate ways, and I hurried to catch the last train. The city I live in doesn't have a train that runs all night, which honestly kind of sucks. Anyway, I got off at my station and started the 15-minute walk home. It was late September, so it was already starting to get cold. I was exhausted. All I wanted was to get home, heat up a frozen pizza, and go to bed. Then I heard one of the loudest, most terrifying screams I've ever heard in my life. It was definitely a human scream, a man's to be exact.
It sounded like someone was getting his leg cut off, like he was in unbearable pain. I stopped immediately and looked around, trying to figure out where it came from. What made it even stranger was how completely quiet the street had been. Almost every house had already turned its lights off. I was honestly shaken because the whole thing was so unexpected. Then another scream echoed through the night. This time, I had a much better idea of where it was coming from. It was coming from the direction of my house. I immediately started heading home. I wasn't running yet, but I walked as fast as I could while constantly looking over my shoulder and listening carefully for any movement nearby. As I turned the corner near my house, I spotted a group of 6 or 7 people in the distance. They were about 220 yards away. The second they noticed me, they all started running in my direction. I was completely caught off guard. I couldn't understand why anyone would start running at a random person they had just seen on the street. My instincts immediately told me to run. My house was between me and them, and thankfully, it was much closer to me than it was to the group, who were now yelling things I couldn't understand. I made it to my front door, but just as I was about to unlock it, I dropped my keys like something out of a movie. I picked them up, but before unlocking the door, I looked back at the men one last time. They all looked homeless, wearing dirty, ripped clothes. Seeing that only confirmed I'd made the right decision to run. I finally got inside, shut the door, and locked it as quickly as I could. I was breathing hard, and my mind was racing. I kept thinking they were about to break in, and with my parents away, I was completely alone. I stood by the front door in total darkness, listening for what felt like forever, though it was probably only a couple of minutes. Nothing happened.
Everything outside was silent. That was somewhat comforting, but at the same time, it felt incredibly strange. Deep down, I didn't believe the danger was over. I was convinced those people were probably still somewhere outside. After another 2 minutes or so, I slowly walked over to the window and looked outside. There was nobody there. I checked the kitchen window too, but again, I couldn't see anyone. The street was empty,
except for the wind moving the tree branches. Even so, I decided to call 112 and report everything strange that had happened that night. I told the dispatcher everything, including the screams I'd heard earlier. Honestly, she wasn't very helpful at first. She kept asking whether I knew the people who had chased me, and since I hadn't actually been harmed, there wasn't much they could do.
In the end, she said she'd send a patrol car through the area and let me know if the officers noticed anything suspicious. I thanked her and hung up. About 30 minutes later, I saw a police car slowly driving through the neighborhood and passing my house. At that point, I decided to get some sleep because I was completely exhausted. It was already well after midnight. The next morning, I tried not to think too much about what had happened the night before, but I still had so many unanswered questions. My best friend called and told me our other friend wasn't feeling well, so he wouldn't be coming over. It ended up being just the two of us hanging out at my house all day. Before he left, I briefly mentioned what had happened the night before, without going into much detail, because I didn't want him to worry. We joked about it, but I could tell he was genuinely concerned. My parents called, too, and asked if everything was okay. I told them it was because I knew how easily my mom worries. I planned to tell them everything after they got back home. That evening, before going to bed, I checked every door and window to make sure they were locked. I turned on a movie and slowly stopped thinking about everything that had happened the night before. Then I could have sworn I heard a loud bang outside. It sounded like someone had thrown a rock at the house. I grabbed the remote and turned off the TV so I could listen more carefully. I wasn't even sure if I'd actually heard something or if paranoia was getting to me. Once again, everything was completely silent. I had no idea what was going on, but my fear was slowly turning into frustration and anger. I looked out my bedroom window on the second floor, which faces the street, but everything seemed normal.
I decided to stay awake and keep watch for as long as I could. But I guess I eventually dozed off around 5 a.m. A few hours later, I woke up to the sound of my family arriving home. I'd slept through almost half the day, which is very unusual for me. At first, they joked that I'd obviously just woken up and asked me to help carry their bags in from the car. I figured it was finally time to tell them everything that had happened over the previous 3 days. Just as I expected, they were upset and worried, but they were also relieved that I was okay. About a week and a half later, we installed security cameras at the front and back of the house, and thankfully, nothing like that has happened since. I never heard anything else from the police either. To this day, I still have no idea why those people chased me. Who was the man screaming? And why was he in so much pain?
Was he really a victim of those people? Or was the screaming part of some twisted plan to lure someone closer before chasing, robbing, or even worse? And was the loud bang I heard the following night connected to everything? Or was my mind simply playing tricks on me? I've asked myself those same questions countless times, but I don't think I'll ever know the truth.